Good afternoon, church. How are you all doing this afternoon? Are you ready to hear the word? I'm so excited to, convey you our third message from this series entitled Grace Greater Than. In fact, today I think we will be encouraged from a perspective that we have not thought about where we can probably, or the source of our encouragement can come from. But before that, allow me to review a little bit on where we're at in terms of understanding this very important series of message that God would allow us to understand this afternoon. The first Sunday, we heard the message about grace greater than our mistakes. It's nicer to sound mistakes, but it's actually sin, right? Grace greater than our mistakes. The appeal for all of us as we understand this word grace is as if this will again be the first time we hear the word grace. In fact, as much as I can, as much as the effort I can exert in trying to explain to you what grace is about, it will always fall short because to be really understood, this word grace is to experience it. In fact, one of our perspective also is to understand this from the point of view if grace will not be present in our lives. So we said that grace is greater than our sins. We said that grace is greater than religion. Remember that message 3 Sundays ago? Grace is greater than our shame. Grace is greater than our secrets. So last Sunday, if you were here, we kind of, reverse, not necessarily this equation, grace greater than mistakes, but the recipient of grace. Grace greater than our hearts, right? We said that if truly we have received grace in our lives, then the litmus test, the gauge, the measuring stick would be how we can also extend grace to others. And we studied about the parable of the unmerciful servant, right? Grace is greater than repayment. Grace is greater than revenge. And grace greater than resentment. Today, church, it is my joy and privilege to share with you this message entitled Grace Greater Than Our Weaknesses. So I told you that the source of encouragement that we will gather and enjoy this afternoon comes from a source or an idea that probably it would be farthest from our mind would be a source of encouragement. Our weaknesses. And if you have your Bibles with you, our text is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. But let me just give you a little background on this letter of Paul to the Christians in Corinth for the second time. So you know that there are 2 letters of Apostle Paul to the Christians in Corinth. Corinth is really one of the churches that Paul, visited and stayed for a longer tenure of time compared to the other churches. In fact, this one city in Greece during that time is very progressive, and it is known for its culture. It's known for its architecture. Even today, when you say Corinthian architecture or structures, it depicts some sort of a magnificent and elite type of architecture. So Paul wrote to the Christians in Corinth twice, but in between his first and second letter, there were some challenges that happened during the time in the church of Corinth. There were some other religious groups, false teachers, that they were preaching about things and they were basing it from their religious strength. The resume that they have, their accomplishments that they do. It might be a noble thing, it might be a good thing, but it is not in accordance with the teachings, biblical teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so those Christians in Corinth are being won over to these other teachings by the false teachers, right? And so Paul wrote the second time to these Christians in Corinth to make sure that he again allowed them to understand what the grace of God is about. But if you were Paul, during that time, you have this also temptation. Right? If you hear someone who is winning over Christians because of their strength in their religious practices, strength in their religious resume, you are Paul, right? You are more qualified also than these people. and you have this temptation that you might try to do the same way as they're doing. If you have this tall of a resume as your religious strength, Paul has higher resume, right? So that would be probably the mindset of Paul during that time. So he was really quite of a challenge during that time. How will I try to write to Christians in Corinth to encourage them? But Paul found, through the guidance and leading of the Holy Spirit, found a way to encourage these Christians in Corinth and not succumb to the temptation of him, better than these other religious leaders, right? But he found a way to encourage them to be faithful in their faith by showing them the power that God gives amidst weaknesses, amidst challenges, right? Amidst inadequacies in his life. So, and we can relate to that today in our society today, because in our society today, we live in a culture, right, that puts a lot of value on our own strengths, on our own abilities, and our own accomplishments. In fact, if I probably would be Paul during that time, I probably would have thought otherwise, right? I could have probably fought these religious leaders and false teachers, the same way they're winning over other Christians by religious strengths, right? By my resume, right? And that's normal, that's typical. That's our default mechanism. But, the Scripture is really a source of wisdom. It really guides us to the proper way of doing the godly way that God would want us to act. So let me just show you Paul's strengths this afternoon. Right? It's quite an irony because the title is Paul's Strengths, and you will see later on that his strength really lied on his weaknesses. But, he makes a case for his background, his heritage, his passion, and zeal. So let's look at Paul's credibility here. And you would see, and you would find here that even though he was writing these things, he was not really convinced that he should write these things. He consistently introduced himself as a slave of Christ. So whenever he introduced himself in any churches that he visited, even when he wrote to these churches after his missionary journeys, he already usually introduced himself as a slave of Christ. And that's his resume. That's his credibility. Really a radical way, on extreme opposite, on how people today are being won over, right? Because if you look at our society today, we have to be very strong in the Word, because there are a lot of teachings in our society today that would really put pressure on us because of their religious strengths. Maybe their numbers. Maybe the way they're doing. Their worship is really the in thing. During that time, that's what's happening, right? What's happening, because Corinth is really a central place where people call it a destination place, like New York, like California. People go there, right? Because they want to experience a different kind of culture. And the religious leaders, they have these methods that they try to lure people to come and listen to them, focusing on other things rather than focusing on the Word of God, on the truth. I think we can all relate to this. A lot of people now, even today, they think that they are following the tenets of the Scriptures, the principles of the Scriptures, and they are being lured because of the strength of the religion, on the pressures, the power, right, that is being shown to them, rather than, as we can see here, the weaknesses. But Paul, he understood that whenever you introduce yourself, one of your biggest resume, if I may put it this way, is that he was a slave of Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 21 to 23, in the NIV translation. We'll be jumping from one translation to the other just to show a more cohesive, and to the point that we understand what the scripture is telling us better, right? So look at this. In verse 21, Paul started, whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about. So if they are boasting about these things, okay, I'm going to speak about these things, but I'm going to speak this as a fool, but let me just speak it the way they're speaking it. Are we understanding this? Right? Because he wants to show these people in Corinth, yeah, if they're telling you that they have this, I have this also. But I'm a fool if I'm saying that I have those things also. You know, it's hard to say fool, but that's what Paul is telling us, right? Look at this. Are they Hebrew? So am I. Right. Are they Israelites? So am I. Right. Are they Abraham's descendants? Well, during that time, you know, you're one of the elite people. If you're Abraham's descendant. In fact, in Colossians, you will find the resume of Apostle Paul also there. He was the Hebrew among Hebrews, right? He was from the tribe of Benjamin, meaning the Benjamite is one of the two tribes among the 12 tribes that did not rebel during that time. So you would see that if you belong to that tribe, you're in the upper society, upper classes of the society. And he was, in fact, it was even mentioned in Colossians, he was circumcised on the 8th day, meaning he belonged to a family that really adheres to the law. But he said here, but are they servants of Christ? Right? Yeah, you know, they're Hebrews. Yeah, they're Israelites. Yeah, they're Abraham's descendants. But are they servants of Christ? Right? And he said, I am out of my mind to talk like this. Right? Paul reluctantly tells about a special revelation. You know, succeeding verses here, you will find Paul, for one reason or another, he had kept this to himself for 14 years. And in other translations, in the NIV translation, he was referring to a third person. But in our translation, he was referring to himself. So you know that in NIV, the third person he was referring to was himself, right? But it was not really a big deal for him. Look at this in verse 1 through 5 in the New Living Translation. Yes, right? This was his experience 14 years ago. Only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body. He had this experience. He didn't know whether he's still alive physically or it was just an out-of-body experience. But he was sharing this to the Christians in Corinth, right? But I do know that I was caught up to paradise. If you have the NIV translation, you have been caught. This man was caught up in the third heaven. It's not only the first heaven. Oh, that's not, it's ordinary. It's not only second heaven. You know, maybe it's the same as the other religious leaders. He was caught up in the third heaven. Right? Paul was saying, yeah, I was caught up in paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words. It's too much for him to write it. It's so much, an experience, that he had, things no human is allowed to tell. That experience is worth boasting about. But I'm not going to do it. Church, I'll give you a moment of transparency here as your pastor. If your pastor has been caught up in the third heaven, you will hear it in Facebook right there and then. I will Instagram it. I will text it to you. Hey, Pastor Arnel had this experience. I was caught up in the third heaven. But Paul kept it to himself for 14 years, and he was just forced to tell the Christians in Corinth because he's trying to make a point here. He's trying to make a point that it's not about him. It's not about religious strength. Right? So if you want to boast, I have this credibility, but I am a slave in Christ, of Christ. That's really who I am. But he focused not on his strength because right after he told in 2 Corinthians that he was caught up in the third heaven, that was just his segue to let the Corinthians know this is where my strength is coming from. And this should be where your strength is coming from. In verse 7, he said, there's this thorn in my flesh. This is my weakness. But this is also my strength. This is where my strength is coming from. We can all relate to this because we all have our weaknesses. We could probably have our own thorn in the flesh, and our mindset might be, this is some sort of a burden in all of us. This is probably what's keeping us, from enjoying God's grace in our lives. But it is that actually the reverse is true, right? Because look at verse 7 and 8. So to keep me from being proud, right? I was given, is that my time already? I was given a thorn in my flesh. A messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. We will discuss later on what we think. When I say we think this thorn in the flesh is, because Paul did not really tell us, or the scripture did not really tell us what this thorn in the flesh is. Because it doesn't matter. Right? It's not about him. He knows that this is the thorn in the flesh. It's not for us to have pity on Paul, because we will find out. Look at this in verse 9 to 10. So every time he comes to the Lord to ask the Lord to take this thorn in the flesh from him, is that natural, church? If we have a thorn in the flesh, are we going to ask God to take it away from us? Yeah. Paul's the same. He asked God to take it away from him. But this is the answer to him of God. This is the answer. Each time, he said, my grace is all you need. Oh, what's the relationship with that? I'm asking you, God, to take this thorn of my flesh from me, and you are telling me the answer is my grace is all you need. Why? Because my power works best in weaknesses. Can you imagine this? Right? It makes sense, church. Sometimes we think we're powerful, but our power compared to God's power is nothing, right? So if we want the power of God to work in our lives, we need to give Him space. We should not be happy about our strengths. In fact, we should be happy when we are weak, because God's power will be in us. Look at what this. So now, Paul said, now, I am glad to boast about my weaknesses. Can you imagine this? The religious leaders, they're winning over people because of their religious strength. And the way Paul is writing to the Christians in Corinth to let them realize that power is nothing. There is power in weaknesses. Right? Because Paul now understood it, and he is now boasting to the Lord for his weaknesses. Right? So that the power of Christ can work through me. I tell you, church, that's what's keeping us from enjoying the grace of God in our lives. Right? We cannot identify our weaknesses. We think we are powerful. We think we are strong. We don't come to God and tell God, take this stone, please, God, I have this in my life. That's why I take pleasure. So Paul took another step, right? He's not only boasting. He takes pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, in the hardships, in the persecutions and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Wow. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Can you imagine this? Right? Paul goes as far as to say in verse 10 that he takes pleasure in his weaknesses. He's more excited about his weaknesses than his strengths. Right? Strength doesn't leave a lot of room for God's power, but in weakness, there is room for God to show what He can do. Allow me to extend this and to share with you 3 more things about grace grace is greater than, that we can relate with. Right? Maybe you were saying, that's Paul, right? He's really filled with the Holy Spirit, right? And he's probably guided by the wisdom coming from God on how to write the Christians in Corinth, and amidst the false teachers really trying to win over people through religious strengths and religious power. here is Paul, he was like a fool when he was telling these people, the Corinthians, about his resume, about his credibility. But he pointed out that he was a slave of Christ, and more importantly now that he rejoices, he takes pleasure in his weaknesses because now he understands that when he is weak, then he is strong. Grace, then, is greater than our infirmities. Infirmities can be sickness, disabilities, or ailments. People would say, maybe the thorn in the flesh, that might be just an allegory. It probably is not literal. But we can clearly see, because of the word flesh in Greek, right, that this is really physical. There is something significant that is happening in the life of Paul that probably was preventing him from doing more for God, and that's why he came to God and asked God to take away his thorn in the flesh, right? So, in 2 Corinthians, as we move along, let's backtrack a little bit in chapter 10, verses 9 through 11, right? I'm sure we can all relate with our infirmities. We experience sickness. Our bodies are failing, right? We have disabilities, things that when, we are not anymore capable of doing because of our physical limitations. Right? Our ailments, the pains, the aches, the moaning that we do every time, every day that we experience. So in verse 9 through 11, in the Message translation, the scripture tells us, and what's this talk about me bullying you with my letters? There's a group probably in Corinth that they were saying that Paul is nothing in person. He was really just bullying them when he writes them. You will find that same tone in 2 Corinthians, because now Paul is really telling them, there are some Christians now in Corinth that were won over by these other false teachers and other religious groups. So they're saying here that Paul is bullying them with his letters. And his letters are brawny and potent, but in person, he's a weakling and mumbles when he talks. So this is probably true when whoever met Paul now at this stage, because this is probably the latter stage of his being a missionary person in his missionary journey career. You remember, 14 years have passed, right? And Paul probably is older. Paul is probably weaker. He has this thorn in the flesh that happened in his life, that they were saying whenever they see Paul now personally, in person, he's now like a weakling. Maybe he's really, bothered by this thorn in the flesh that he was experiencing, and probably he also aged a little, because of the time has passed, and it affected his speech because, as the scripture tells us, and he mumbles when he talks. So that's why, people say he's not a great speaker, he was not a great talker, but he wrote a lot to these Christians. That's why they were telling Paul, you are just bullying us when you write us, but when we see you in person, you're just a weakling. You mumble when you talk, right? It's probably because, Paul has severely been injured. There was a lot of talk about his thorn in the flesh. One school of thought is that Paul now has some sort of a physical deformity. That's why he was a weakling. Can you imagine, being stoned almost to the point of death? Can you imagine that? Right? He was shipwrecked many, many times. Right? He was not only stoned once, right? I think it was 2 or 3 times. He was put in jail. Right? So his life was almost always in danger. So probably Paul has this physical deformity. And I think in one scripture reference, his physical appearance even became a distraction for them to hear the gospel, right? Because that's how Paul now looks. So that's his thorn in the flesh. That's his infirmity during this time. Another school of thought, he had this what we call epilepsy. Paul was epileptic because there was this portion of scriptures in Galatians that he was thanking the church in Galatians by not spitting on him. Because during that time, when you have epilepsy, people think that you have evil spirits in you, and they will spit on you. Right? So they, once people would say, or some people would say he has epilepsy. Some would say he has eye trouble. Again, because he dictated his letters before, right? He dictated his letters before, and now he was writing with big letters. So, people, you would say, right, that Paul has some eye problems. Other people say that he has some migraines, and other people would say he has some stomach problem, right? He suffered malaria during that time. Well, Paul is not specific about his thorn in the flesh. When Paul wrote, a lot of times he was specific on a lot of things, but when it comes to his infirmity, his thorn in the flesh, he didn't even mention what it is. He just said it was thorn in the flesh for two reasons, probably. He doesn't want it to be about him. Right? Before, it was, a weakness, but now it's his strength. He delights on it, right? So he stopped asking God to take it away from him, because now he realized that his weakness is now his strength. The scripture tells us, God says, my grace is sufficient to you. For when you are weak, then you are strong. He knows the metaphor is very helpful for his thorn in the flesh. Whatever thorn you have, we can all relate to this church, right? We can identify our thorn in our flesh. Right? I think we can. This is very relevant. I say things are relevant if it is real, we can experience it. And if it is relevant, it's impactful because we can experience this. Paul had thorn in the flesh. He's not Superman that you can say, right? That he was able to do all those things that he did for the glory of God. He was just like us. Probably he has some deformities, whether he has epilepsy, whether he has malaria, he has this infirmity present in his life, right? And this is the thing that we can relate with him. That Paul understood that grace is greater than in his infirmities. Hence, he is showing us grace is greater than our infirmities. Not only grace is greater than infirmities, grace is also greater than our inabilities. Maybe when we hear the word weakness, this is probably what comes to our mind. What is our weakness? Meaning, what are the things that we are not adequate in doing? Right? Maybe we don't have a better talent in this, so that's our weakness. In fact, when we go to a job interview, we don't really want to mention our weaknesses. When an interviewer would ask for our weaknesses, we would cover our weaknesses and mention some sort of a strength to be our weakness. Right? So let me give you an example. So when an interviewer would interview Andrea, and Andrea is being asked, Andrea, what are your weaknesses? Right? Andrea would answer, one of my weaknesses is I'm very task-oriented. Right? That's a weakness, right? So if you give me a project, and when I see some things that are not done, I get distracted from my project. I try to do these things, and sometimes I get distracted from my project, but I try to do the things that is in front of me to get it completed. In the end, I got a lot more things completed, but I was not able to do the project you gave me. So that's a weakness, but it's actually a strength also, right? So you cover up a weakness, right, by saying another strength. Another example would be, so what's your weakness, Brother Brian? Brother Brian would say, I'm a workaholic. A workaholic. So the interviewer would say, that's good, right? It's not a weakness. Yeah, so it's our inabilities, right? But it's really a strength disguised as a weakness. But, where do we leave room for God here? Right? This is not what God is telling us. In fact, look at Acts chapter 4, verse 13. The scripture tells us, when they saw, this was Peter, right? Peter, James, and John. Peter, John, right? When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, right? Ordinary men, they were astonished, right? So they would always, people our culture will always associate being unschooled, being ordinary, to being weak. Right? Their ordinariness made them more impactful. I heard a story by this writer. Maybe you have heard about her. She wrote a lot of things from personal experience. Corrie ten Boom, right? So Corrie ten Boom, she wrote about this Russian woman who really has some physical disabilities. She was actually confined to like a sofa, just lying down because she had multiple sclerosis, if I may pronounce it, sclerosis, right? And then MS for short, right? And then her husband is the one taking care of her. The only thing that she can move is actually her index finger, right? And because of she can move her index finger, she can type, but only one finger. So it's a weakness, right? It's a disability. She was Russian during that time. And probably if you have seen her, you would have prayed that God would heal her. Would you agree? Right? Because we also always think that our disabilities, our inabilities, are weaknesses, and there's no strength in that. But according to the story, this woman, this Russian woman, because of being sick for a long time, no one bothers her. The police will not even check up on her because they think that she's really, disabled, right? And because of that, she was able to translate the Bible in Russian by just one finger. Translate the whole Bible in Russian. And no one bothered her because she was disabled. Can you imagine that? How many fingers do we have in church? I have 20, right? Some of you maybe have more or less, right? I'm just kidding, but I'm just saying, have we ever been able to translate the Bible to another language? Right? And yet, this woman who has been confined to this sofa for all her life was used mightily by God with just one finger working, right? Because in our weakness, there is strength. And last, church, grace is greater than our insecurities. Oh, Pastor, this is really a struggle. I don't like to say, I need help. I don't like to say, I am having a tough time. Right? I don't like to say, I'm stuck and I need a hand. I don't like to say, I am in over my head. I don't like to say, I don't have what it takes, or I am not sure what to do. Right? Those words are not part of my vocabulary. But those words, according to Paul, are where he learned more about grace. Right? These are where there is most potential to experience God's grace in our insecurities. Doesn't it make sense that now Paul delights in his weaknesses rather than in his strengths? Right? Can you imagine this? So I think I have mentioned to you some extreme teachings in the Bible if we compare it to the teachings of this world, right? First will be the last will be the first, right? We always say the first should be the first, the last will be the last, right? But the Bible is telling us differently, right? If you want to win your life, you need to lose it. And whoever loses his life will save it. Can you imagine this, right? Same with this, right? The teaching here is there is strength in weakness. In fact, you have to delight more in your weaknesses rather than in your strength. But this is not us, right? We will not try to ask for help. I remember one time when my family and I went to our snow trip just the three of us. We went to a place where we stayed in a hotel, and just near the hotel, there's a ice skating rink. All right, so we were happy. I was happy, but as soon as we all rented this skates, we put it on, and I realized it's my first time to do it. Right? At a very young age, at this, this only happened last year. So I have to think twice. Right? Do I have to admit that I cannot do it, or do I have to go through this? Right? So my wife and my son, they enjoyed their time together because eventually I said I cannot do it because of the reason that if I get injured, it will be hard for them to bring me to the hospital. Right? Bottom line, church, I don't want to ask for help. It would be very, very embarrassing for me if I get injured. Right? Can you believe that I'm sharing this with you right now? If I get injured because I don't know how to ice skate. But I know some of you don't also, so it's okay. But eventually I saw them having fun and I missed it. I was only in the sidelines drinking my hot chocolate because it's cold, but I probably rationalized it. If I get injured, I will have to preach on Sunday. How can I do that? Right? But because we don't want to ask for help, we don't want to admit our weaknesses, there is less power in that. Right? I missed out on God's grace in my life, not because I am strong, but I am too proud to be weak. Maybe think about this, church. Maybe we are missing God's grace not because we are strong. We are missing God's grace in our lives because we are too proud to admit that we are weak. 2 Corinthians, this is our last verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. Paul is telling Christians in Corinth that there was a time in his life that he had too much pressure. Look at this, right? We were under great pressure. Probably Paul's insecurity is coming out here, right? Far beyond our ability to endure. I think that we can all experience this. We have some challenges in our lives that we can handle on ourselves, right? And look at verses 8 and 9 again in the Message translation. As it turned out, because there's too much pressure, right? We cannot handle this pressure anymore. We are put into the situation where we cannot handle it on our own. We are not strong enough. We think we are strong enough, but we are put in the situation that our strength is not enough. So it's too much. And look at what Paul is telling us here. As it turned out, when the pressure is too much and we gave up, it was the best thing that could have happened when we gave up. When the pressure is too much. Why? Instead of trusting in our own strength, that's our default, we will always trust in our own strength or wits to get out of it, we were forced to trust God totally. We realized, it's over and above our head. We are only limited in our strength. It's a good thing that the situation is more than we can handle. It's a good thing that our challenges is more than we can handle, because if it's within, we think that we can handle, we probably would have used our own strength. But Paul is telling us it's a good thing because we were forced to trust God totally. Not a bad idea, since He's the God who raised the dead. Not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea to trust God in difficult circumstances. It's not a bad idea. When we admit that we are weak, it's not a bad idea. May we find ourselves in a place where the bar is set too heavy. May we find ourselves where the weight is too much. May we find ourselves where the pressure is too intense, where the struggle is too overwhelming that you can't do it. We cannot do it. And suddenly our default approach of trusting in ourselves, suddenly our default approach of saying, I got this, it's not going to work. It may happen to you because at that moment you may be forced to trust God totally. And when you are forced to trust God totally, it is not a bad idea. Because, anyways, He's the God who raised the dead. Right? In our weakness, there is strength. Paul says that we can delight in our insecurities because that's where God has the most power to show up. Church, I wonder how many times we've missed out on God's grace and power. Not because it was not available, but because we didn't want to be vulnerable and ask for help. If the level of our weakness determines the amount of grace and power you will receive. Let me repeat that. If the level of our weaknesses, of your weaknesses, determines the amount of God's grace or God's grace and power you will receive, then doesn't it make sense that we would take pleasure in our weaknesses? Doesn't that make sense? That's Paul's telling us, that we rejoice, we take pleasure in our weaknesses. And remember, grace is greater than our weaknesses. Church, before we stand, let me just try to summarize this for a little bit by giving you some sort of a challenge and an illustration in your life. Right? Picture this in your mind. You can close your eyes. Picture this in your mind that you're holding a cup or a mug. Your cup and your mug is empty. That represents your weaknesses. That the cup represents your vulnerability. Right? And then you find a hose hanging on the wall. You cannot see what's behind the wall. And you want your cup to be filled with water through that hose. So you come, turn on the hose, the faucet, coming, and the hose is there, so the water starts flowing. And as soon as your cup will be filled, it stops. Another time in your life, probably when you have some scare in your health, probably your marriage is not working so well, probably you have a challenge in your financial life, you come with a bucket, an empty bucket, right? And you want God to fill your bucket with grace, so you come to that wall where this hose is hanging. You turn on the water, and water flows into your bucket. You don't know if the water would be enough, but sure enough, as soon as the water is almost, as soon as the bucket is being filled or almost filled, the water stopped. Another month passed by in your life, right? And maybe you lost your job, right? Maybe there's some problems with your son, with your daughter, and the pressure is mounting, and you need God's grace again, right? So you came to that faucet with a wheelbarrow, right? You think that the wheelbarrow will not be filled with water, but as soon as you turned on the faucet, water starts flowing again. And sure enough, as soon as the wheelbarrow is almost full, the water stopped. The last, you came to that same place driving a semi with a tank full, or with an empty tank, so that the water, you will fill the tank with water. It might be a time where the company that you have worked for the longest time has gone bankrupt. It can be a time where you have lost a loved one. It can be a time where you have known about the affair. You really need grace in your life. And you know that tank of water, that empty tank of water will never be filled by water because it's too big. And you put the hose inside. And sure enough, you waited for a while. The water started to pour in. And at the time that the tank will be, water will overflow from the tank, the water stopped. But this time, out of your curiosity, you said, what's behind this? What's behind this wall? How come every time I go and try to fill up any container I bring to this hose, it's getting filled up? So you try to tear down the walls, right? And you know, you followed the hose, it's a mile long, and then when you saw where the water is coming from, it's miles and miles of ocean. That's where the water is coming from. That is what the grace of God can bring into your life. But the only thing is, how big of a container will you bring to this hose to fill it up with God's grace? You have to look at yourself and surrender your weaknesses to God, and you come to Him, right? Not asking, right, for your weaknesses to be taken away, but asking God to fill you with His grace. If I were you, I would bring that semi, right? That empty tank of water, because I assure you, God will fill that with His grace. Because the Scripture is telling us, right, His grace is sufficient in us, and His power is made perfect by our weaknesses. For where we are weak, then we are strong. Let's all stand up, church. Let's celebrate. Let's celebrate that grace is greater than our weaknesses.